All right, today we're going to try and decode the very foundation of how we organize ourselves as humans. We're talking about political theory. It's like this invisible architecture that shapes our entire world. So, yeah, let's just dive right in. Seriously, have you ever just stopped and wondered about that? I mean, you've got billions of people with different goals, beliefs, and desires. How is it not just complete and utter chaos all the time? Well, it turns out it's not just luck. The answer is in these invisible blueprints, these really powerful, often competing ideas about power, justice, and what it even means to be human. That's political theory, and it's the architecture of our modern world. So for the next 5 minutes, think of this as a crash course. We're going to explore the code that runs our societies. We'll look at the most basic questions, the different blueprints for building a state, the ideals that act as the software, and yeah, even the cracks that threaten to bring the whole thing crashing down. Okay, so first things first. Every single political theory out there, no matter how complex it seems, is really just trying to answer one huge question. How do we get from a world of total chaos to a world with some kind of order? So you've got these two extremes, right? On one side, you have what the philosopher Thomas Hobbes famously called the state of nature. Basically, a free-for-all, a war of all against all. Sounds pretty rough. And on the other side, you have an ordered society, with laws and government and some kind of peace. The big puzzle, the central challenge for any political theory is, how do you build a bridge from that chaos to that order? Okay, so let's say we all agree that order is the goal. Awesome. The next question is, how do you actually build it? What's the blueprint going to look like? Now, there are a ton of different designs out there, but let's take a look at three really different approaches. First up, we've got federalism. You've probably heard of this one, right? The main idea here is pretty simple. Share the power. So instead of having one big central government holding all the cards, you divide power up between a national government and smaller units like states or provinces. Now, kind of building on that, you have something called a compound democracy. This is a model that's really designed for when you're trying to bring together a bunch of previously independent states. Think of something like the European Union. The whole point is to stop any single group from becoming a permanent tyrannical majority. And it does that by separating power in all sorts of ways, both up and down and side to side. Okay, now let's switch gears to something totally different, African socialism. This idea came about in the mid-20th century, right as many African nations were gaining their independence. They were looking for a third way, something that wasn't Western capitalism or Soviet communism. It was this really pragmatic approach that tried to unite people for national development, and it did that by looking back to pre-colonial communal values. So let's just quickly put these side by side. Federalism is all about sharing power between different levels, like in the United States. A compound democracy is obsessed with preventing a tyranny of the majority, like you see in the structure of the EU. And then African socialism had a totally different goal, post-colonial development. And to do that, it often centralized power in one party to get everyone moving in the same direction, like what happened in Tanzania under Nyerere. But look, a state isn't just about its physical structure, its hardware. It also needs software, right? An operating system. And that's where these guiding ideals come in. The core philosophies about how power should be used and what justice even looks like. Take this quote from Confucius. This is so interesting because it completely reframes where politics begins. For him, political order doesn't start in some big government building. It starts at home, in the family. He believed that if you can get relationships in the family right, harmonious, virtuous, that good energy will just naturally ripple outwards to the entire state. In this view, government is really just family ethics, but scaled way up. All right, now for a very different ideal, constitutionalism. The goal here is to create what John Adams called a government of laws and not of men. And it has a three-step recipe for that. Step 1, limit and separate power. Don't let any one person or group have too much. Step 2, protect individual rights. Write them down so the state can't just trample all over them. And step 3, make the Constitution itself the higher law that even the government has to obey. The bottom line? No one is above the law. And finally, let's look at two competing ethical engines that can power a society. You can really think of it as rules versus results. So contractualism is all about the rules. It asks, could everyone reasonably agree to the principles behind a decision before we even know how it will turn out? If so, it's fair. Consequentialism, on the other hand, couldn't care less about the rules. It's all about the results. It just asks which action creates the best outcome, like the greatest good for the greatest number, even if getting there is a little messy. So let's imagine we've built our perfect state. It's got a solid structure, a noble operating system, but here's the thing. No system is perfect. And what happens when those foundations are put under extreme stress? What happens in an emergency? That's where we find the cracks. And this quote from the jurist Carl Schmitt is, well, it's pretty chilling, and it gets right to the point. He basically said, if you want to know who's really in charge, don't look at who makes the rules for normal, everyday life. Look for the person who gets to decide when to throw all the rules out the window. This is what's known as the state of exception. It's this murky, legal gray area where a government just hits pause on the normal rule of law because it says there's some huge existential threat. Think about rights being suspended during a war, or what many scholars point to in the War on Terror after 9/11. It's this bizarre paradox where a democracy basically suspends itself in order to save itself. But the conversation didn't stop with Schmitt. The thinker Walter Benjamin came along and completely flipped it, saying, hey, for oppressed people, this state of emergency isn't an exception at all. It's their normal, everyday reality. And then, more recently, a philosopher named Giorgio Agamben took it even further. He argued that we've all started to live in a permanent state of exception, where our legal protections can be stripped away at any moment, creating what he calls bare life. But that raises an even bigger question. What if the system itself is the emergency? For a thinker like Frantz Fanon, who was writing about colonialism, some systems are just so deeply violent and oppressive that you can't just tweak them or reform them. He argued that for people who are colonized, freedom isn't a gift the oppressor can just hand over. No, it has to be taken, seized, through a direct confrontation with the system's own violence. And that brings us to one last really big question to leave you with. So many of these blueprints and ideals we've talked about were built on an old idea, the idea that humans are basically a blank slate. But what if that's just wrong? What if, as modern science suggests, we aren't blank slates at all, but we come hardwired with certain predispositions? So the real question for us right now is this. Can our political theories, all of them, adapt to this new understanding of who we are? Or are we trying to run our 21st century world on some dangerously outdated code?